The September sun hung low over the white mountains of Arizona Territory in the year of our Lord 1876, casting long shadows across a landscape that would soon run red with blood and regret. Corporal Miles Sutton crouched behind a cluster of manzanita bushes, his Pennsylvania rifle heavy in his hands, his heart hammering against his ribs like a prisoner demanding release. He was 29 years old. He had survived Gettysburg, Antietam, and a dozen other battles whose names he could barely remember through the fog of powder smoke and screaming. He thought he had seen the worst of what men could do to each other. He was wrong. Captain Morrison's orders had been clear. No survivors except women and children, and those only for transport to the San Carlos Reservation. The Apache had raided 3 settlements in as many weeks. The Army's patience, never abundant when it came to the tribes, had finally run dry like a desert creek in August. The wickiups burned. That was the first thing Miles would remember in the years to come, lying awake in the dark hours before dawn. The way the traditional Apache dwellings caught fire so easily, their brush and hide construction no match for the torches his fellow soldiers carried. Black smoke rose into the impossibly blue sky, and Miles could smell mesquite and something worse, something he did not want to name. A warrior burst from one of the burning structures. He was young, perhaps no older than Miles himself, with long black hair flying loose and a rifle clutched in his hands. His face was painted for war streaks of white and red across bronze skin, but his eyes held something Miles recognized from every mirror he had looked into since the war began. Fear, determination, the desperate knowledge that death was coming and the only choice left was how to meet it. The warrior fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dust 3 feet to Miles's left. Training took over. Miles raised his rifle, sighted down the barrel, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil jolted his shoulder. The warrior fell. Miles rose from his cover rifle, ready for another threat, his ears ringing from the gunshot. He moved forward, boots crunching on the dry earth, until he stood over the body. The warrior lay on his back, eyes open, and already glazing a hole in his chest that leaked dark blood into the thirsty ground. He had been protecting his family. Miles could see that now. The wickiup behind him, the one he had emerged from, was larger than the others. A family dwelling. Movement caught Miles's eye. A woman emerged from the smoke, a baby clutched to her chest. She was young, younger than Miles had expected, with a face that would have been beautiful if not twisted by grief and terror. Her traditional Apache dress was smudged with ash. The baby in her arms could not have been more than a few weeks old, and it cried with the thin, persistent wail of the very young. Their eyes met. 3 seconds, that was all. 3 seconds that would stretch across 2 years and hundreds of miles and change the course of both their lives. She was perhaps 22, with skin the color of honey in late afternoon light and eyes like amber catching fire. Her hair hung long and loose, black as a raven's wing. There was a thin scar on her left wrist, pale against her skin, shaped like a crescent moon. Miles raised his rifle. His finger rested on the trigger. Behind him, he could hear Captain Morrison shouting orders, could hear the other soldiers moving through the camp, could hear screams and gunfire, and the crackle of flames eating everything they touched. The woman did not run. She stood there holding her baby and looked at Miles with an expression he would spend the next 2 years trying to understand. Not pleading, not defiant. Something else. Something like recognition, as if she could see straight through to the rotten core of him, to all the things he had done and would never be able to undo. Miles lowered his rifle. The woman's eyes widened fractionally. She understood. For one more heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then she turned and ran, the baby still crying against her chest, disappearing into the smoke and the pinon pines that dotted the hillside beyond the burning camp. Miles never reported what he had seen. When Captain Morrison asked if there had been any escapees in his sector, Miles lied. It was not the first lie he had told in uniform, but it would become the one that mattered most. That night, as the company made camp 10 miles from the smoldering ruins of the Apache village, Miles took out the small journal he kept in his saddlebag. By firelight, he wrote the date, the location, and a description of what had happened. His hand shook as he drew a sketch from memory. The woman's face. the baby in her arms, the way the smoke had curled around them like a living thing. He did not know her name. He did not know if she had survived the night or the week or the long forced march to San Carlos that would follow. He only knew that her husband, the warrior he had killed, had died protecting them, that the warrior had been braver than Miles would ever be, and that if there was a God anywhere in the smoke-filled sky, maybe letting her live would balance even one soul on the scales of judgment. It would not. Miles knew that, even as he wrote it, but he had to believe in something, or else the killing would never stop. 2 years passed. Miles Sutton stood in the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, Montana Territory on a September afternoon in 1878 and wondered if he was losing his mind. The town sprawled before him like a drunk's bad decision, all weathered wood and false fronts, and the kind of desperate optimism that characterized every settlement west of the Mississippi. Salvation through silver or gold or cattle or wheat. It never mattered what the particular delusion was. The fever was always the same. He had ridden 4 days without proper rest, changing horses twice his buckskin stallion near collapse beneath him. A prospector in Billings had mentioned the auction with the casual disgust of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by human depravity, but still possessed enough of his soul to be sickened by it. An Apache woman, a baby, being sold to settle debts. The prospector had not known her name, had not cared enough to ask. But he had mentioned she was young, that her white husband had died of fever, that she had a child about 6 months old. Miles had felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. He told himself it could not possibly be the same woman. Apache women were not uncommon in Montana Territory, though most had been driven onto reservations or killed outright. A white husband was unusual, but not impossible. A 6-month-old baby fit the timeline if the child Miles had seen as a newborn had somehow survived the past 2 years. But the scar. The prospector had mentioned it almost as an afterthought. A crescent-shaped scar on her left wrist, pale against darker skin. Miles knew that scar. He had memorized every detail of the woman's face and form during those 3 seconds when he had held her life in his hands and chosen, for reasons he still did not fully understand, to let her go. Now he stood in Redemption Creek with dust coating his clothes and exhaustion pulling at his bones, and listened to the auctioneer's voice carry across the gathered crowd. The platform had been erected in the town square, if such a grandiose term could be applied to the intersection of 2 dirt roads. Perhaps 30 people had gathered, a mix of miners with dirt still under their fingernails, ranchers in from the surrounding country townspeople who had come to gawk or judge or participate. The women present kept their distance, their faces a mixture of disgust and fear, and something that might have been pity if it had not been so thoroughly salted with contempt. On the platform stood a woman and a child. Miles felt the world narrow to a point. 2 years fell away like dead leaves in autumn wind. It was her. The same face, though older now, marked by hardship and loss. The same dark hair, though braided now in a single plait that hung down her back. The same amber eyes, though they held something different now. Not terror, not grief. Something colder and harder, like flint waiting for the spark. She wore a faded calico dress that had seen better days, patched at the elbows and hem. Her feet were bare despite the September chill. In her arms she held a baby perhaps 6 or 7 months old, with lighter skin than his mother, and eyes that caught the afternoon sun with an almost startling blue-green color. A mixed-blood child. White father, Apache mother. The baby cooed and reached for his mother's face with the unself-conscious joy of the very young, unaware that he and his mother stood on an auction block like cattle or furniture or any other property to be bought and sold. The auctioneer was a banker named Silas Turner, a man whose soft hands and softer middle spoke of a life spent taking rather than making. He had the kind of face that would be unremarkable except for the eyes, which were small and hard and calculated the worth of everything they landed on. Turner addressed the crowd with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to public speaking. "Folks, as executor of the late Patrick Flynn's estate, it falls to me to settle his considerable debts. Before you stands his widow and child. The woman is young and strong, good for cooking, cleaning, and whatever else you might need." His tone made the unspoken implications crystal clear. Several men in the crowd shifted their weight, their eyes traveling over the woman's body with an assessment that had nothing to do with her domestic skills. The woman, for her part, stood straight. She did not cower, did not weep. She held her baby close and looked out over the crowd with a gaze that managed to be both distant and intimate, as if she saw each of them clearly and found them all equally wanting. "Bidding starts at $50 for the pair," Turner announced. "The half-breed can be sold separately if preferred." A miner near the front, a burly man with arms like tree trunks and a face that suggested he had never met a problem he could not solve, with his fists raised his hand. "50." Turner nodded. $50 for Mr. Clyde. "Do I hear 60? A rancher in a battered Stetson countered. 60. 70, called another voice. The bidding continued. Miles stood at the back of the crowd, his horse's reins wrapped around his fist, and felt something dark and terrible rising in his chest. Rage, shame. The sick certainty that he was watching his own sins made manifest in the bright Montana sunshine. This was his fault. Not directly, perhaps. He had not killed Patrick Flynn, had not driven this woman to Redemption Creek, had not placed her on this platform. But the chain of causation stretched back through 2 years and 400 miles to a burning Apache village where Miles had pulled a trigger and ended one life while sparing another. The warrior he had killed had been this woman's husband. Miles was certain of it now with the kind of bone-deep knowledge that bypassed logic entirely. She had married again after San Carlos had found some measure of safety with an Irish immigrant who had been kind or desperate or foolish enough to take an Apache wife. And now Flynn was dead, and his debts demanded payment, and here she stood being sold like livestock to men who would use her until there was nothing left to use. Miles could not allow it, not because he was noble, not because he was good, but because if he stood by and did nothing, if he let this happen, then the warrior's death would have been for nothing. The woman's survival would have been for nothing, and Miles himself would be nothing more than what he had always suspected he was, a killer without the courage to face what he had killed. The bidding reached $85. The miner Clyde stood with his hand raised and a gleam in his eye that made Miles's stomach turn. Turner was about to call the sale when Miles urged his horse forward, the crowd parting before him. $100. His voice carried across the square rough from disuse and the dust of 4 days' hard riding. Heads turned. The woman on the platform turned as well, and her eyes found his. For the second time in 2 years, they looked at each other across a space filled with smoke and blood, and all the things that should never have happened but did anyway. Miles saw her stiffen, saw something flicker across her face too quick to name but impossible to miss. Recognition, no. Not quite, but something, a sense of familiarity, like a half-remembered dream, or a melody heard once in childhood and never quite forgotten. He dismounted with the kind of fluid grace that came from a lifetime on horseback, despite the exhaustion that made his legs feel like water. His boots hit the dusty street with 2 soft thuds. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with dark brown hair streaked early with silver at the temples. His face was weathered by sun and hardship-lined in ways that made him look older than his 31 years. Blue eyes, pale as winter sky, regarded the crowd without warmth. Turner's expression shifted from professional interest to something more calculating. "Mister, we're nearly done here. This gentleman has bid 85. Miles walked toward the platform, each step deliberate, his spurs chiming softly. The crowd fell silent. Even the baby stopped fussing, as if sensing the change in atmosphere. $100, Miles repeated. "Gold, right now. That cover the debt." Turner licked his lips. "Well, actually, the total debt is $120. Miles reached into his vest and withdrew a small leather pouch. He opened it and poured gold coins onto the auctioneer's table, counting them out with the careful precision of a man who knew exactly what he was buying and what it would cost. 120, that settled it. The coins gleamed in the afternoon sun. Real gold, not scrip or promises. Turner's eyes went wide. Whatever objections he might have raised died in his throat, replaced by the universal language of profit. "Going once," Turner called, his voice lacking its earlier enthusiasm. "Going twice." He paused, perhaps hoping for a counterbid that would drive the price higher. None came. "Sold to Mr. Sutton, Miles Sutton." Miles climbed the steps to the platform. Up close, the woman was smaller than he remembered, barely reaching his shoulder. But there was nothing diminished about her. She held herself like a queen in exile, all dignity and suppressed fury. Her eyes met his, and Miles felt the impact like a physical blow. Amber and gold and flecks of green like forest floor in dappled sunlight. The scar on her wrist was exactly as he remembered it, a pale crescent that stood out against her skin. He removed his hat, an automatic gesture of respect. "Ma'am?" Her voice when she spoke was low and measured, with only the faintest accent coloring the edges of her words. Why, one word, a universe of questions contained in a single syllable. Miles was acutely aware of the crowd watching them, of Turner hovering nearby, of the baby in her arms who had begun to fuss again. This was not the place for truth. This was not the place for anything except the careful navigation of social fiction. "Not here," he said quietly. "I have a wagon. We can talk once we're away from town." Her chin lifted slightly, pride barely contained. "How do I know your intentions are better than theirs?" A fair question, an impossible question. Miles had no good answer, so he offered the only one he had. "You don't, but I give you my word that no harm will come to you or your boy under my protection." The woman studied him for a long moment. Her gaze was disconcertingly direct, and Miles had the uncomfortable sensation of being weighed and measured and found wanting in ways he could not begin to articulate. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Very well." Miles helped her down from the platform, his hand at her elbow, careful not to grip too tightly or hold too long. She allowed the contact but did not lean on him, maintaining her balance and her dignity even as they navigated the rough wooden steps. The crowd murmured as they passed. Miles heard fragments of conversation, speculation, and judgment rendered in whispers that were not quite quiet enough. "Sutton's got himself a squaw. Wonder what he wants with a half-breed baby. Probably lonely up on that ranch of his." Miles ignored them all. He led the woman to his wagon, a simple affair he had borrowed from a livery in Billings, with the promise of return within the week. His horse was tied to the back, still breathing hard from the journey. The woman climbed up onto the seat without assistance, settling the baby in her lap. Miles took his place beside her and picked up the reins. With a soft click of his tongue, he urged the horses forward. They left Redemption Creek behind in a cloud of dust and unspoken questions. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the jingle of harness, and the soft burbling sounds the baby made as he looked around at his new surroundings with wide, curious eyes. Miles stole glances at the woman beside him. In profile, her face was all clean lines and strong bones, the kind of beauty that would last because it came from structure rather than softness. She held the baby with practiced ease, one arm supporting his weight, while her other hand steadied him against the wagon's motion. Finally, she broke the silence. "You called me ma'am. You don't know my name." Miles kept his eyes on the road ahead. "No, ma'am, I don't." "But you came anyway. Rode 4 days from the look of your horse. Paid $120 in gold for a woman whose name you don't even know." It was not quite a question, but it demanded an answer nonetheless. "Your name wasn't what mattered," Miles said carefully. "What mattered was that no one should be sold like property." She made a soft sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any humor. Noble sentiment, strange coming from a white man in Montana territory. Miles felt the barb land, but did not rise to it. She had earned the right to her bitterness. "My name is Ayanna," she said after another stretch of silence. "Ayanna Redhawk, Apache, Chiricahua Band. Though I suppose the government would prefer I use my white name, Margaret Flynn." "Which do you prefer?" "Ayanna." The word was firm, allowing no argument. "That baby is called Dakota. It means friend to everyone in Lakota. His father was Irish, but I gave him a name that would remind him he belongs to more than one people." Miles nodded slowly. "Ayanna and Dakota. Those are good names." "And you are Miles Sutton. What brings a man named Miles Sutton to an auction in Redemption Creek with gold in his pocket and a sudden need to purchase people?" Her directness was unsettling. Miles was accustomed to the careful verbal dancing of frontier society, where hard truths were wrapped in layers of euphemism and polite fiction. Ayanna had no patience for such games. "I heard about the auction in Billings," he said. "A prospector mentioned it, said it wasn't right selling a woman and her baby, said the woman's husband had died and left debts. And that was enough for you," the word of a drunk prospector. "He mentioned you were Apache, he mentioned the baby, he mentioned—" Miles hesitated, then committed to the truth. "He mentioned a scar on your wrist, shaped like a crescent moon." Ayanna's free hand moved instinctively to her left wrist, covering the scar. Her eyes narrowed. "You asked him about my scar?" "No, he volunteered it, said it was distinctive." "Why would a scar matter to you?" "Because I saw it 2 years ago," Miles thought. "Because I memorized every detail of you in the 3 seconds before I decided to let you live. Because I have been haunted by you every night since, and when I heard there was an Apache woman being sold in Montana with a baby and a crescent scar, I knew it had to be you." But he could not say any of that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "It doesn't," he lied. I couldn't stand by and let it happen." Ayanna watched him for a long moment, her amber eyes searching his face for something she did not name. Whatever she saw there, it did not seem to satisfy her, but neither did it provoke further questions. She turned her attention back to Dakota, who had begun to fuss with the particular insistence that meant hunger. "I need to feed him," she said, "and I need privacy to do it." Miles immediately pulled the wagon to a stop beside a stand of cottonwoods that offered some shade and shelter from the open road. "Take your time. I'll water the horses." He climbed down and busied himself with the animals, keeping his back turned to give Ayanna the privacy she needed. He heard her climb down from the wagon, heard the soft rustle of fabric as she settled herself on the grass. While the horses drank from a small creek, Miles allowed himself to think about what he had done. He had purchased a woman and child for $120 in gold. Not purchased, he corrected himself immediately. Paid off debts. Freed them from an impossible situation. The distinction mattered even if no one else would see it that way. But what came next? He had a small ranch 2 days' ride north, 100 acres in the foothills, a cabin, a barn, some cattle and horses. It was enough for one man. Could it be enough for 3, and more pressingly, what would he tell Ayanna when she inevitably demanded the full truth? She was not stupid. She had already noticed inconsistencies in his story. How long before she started asking questions he could not answer? Without revealing everything, Miles had no answers. He only knew that he had set something in motion that could not be stopped, and that whatever happened next, it would be shaped by the choices he had made in a burning Apache village 2 years ago. Behind him, he heard Ayanna's voice, soft and low, singing something in Apache to Dakota. The melody was unfamiliar, but achingly beautiful, full of longing and loss, and a tenderness that made Miles's chest tighten. He had killed her first husband. Of that he was now certain. The timeline fit. The location fit. And somewhere deep in his gut, below reason or logic, Miles simply knew. The warrior who had burst from that burning wickiup, the one Miles had shot without hesitation, had been Ayanna's husband, Dakota's father. And now Miles stood here, having paid gold to claim them both, and Ayanna had no idea that the man offering her protection was the same man who had made her a widow. The weight of that secret pressed down on him like physical force. Eventually, Ayanna called that she was ready to continue. Miles helped her back onto the wagon, careful not to look at her directly, and they set off again. The afternoon wore on. The landscape changed gradually from the arid plains around Redemption Creek to the beginning of the foothill country, where pine and aspen started to appear among the sage and grass. The air grew cooler as they climbed in elevation. Dakota fell asleep against his mother's chest, his small body relaxed in the complete trust of infancy. Ayanna's hand moved in slow circles on his back, a gesture so automatic she seemed unaware of doing it. Miles found himself watching them from the corner of his eye. Mother and child. The two people he had spared in a moment of inexplicable mercy, now sitting beside him in a wagon, heading toward a future none of them could predict. "Where are we going?" Ayanna asked, her voice breaking the long silence. "My ranch, about 2 days north of here. Small place, but it's solid. You and Dakota can stay there until you decide what you want to do." "And what do you expect in return?" The question was blunt, but Miles appreciated the directness. Better to establish terms clearly than to operate under false pretenses. "Nothing. You'll have a roof over your head, food to eat, and safety. When you're ready to move on, I'll help you get wherever you want to go." Ayanna's laugh was short and bitter. "Men don't do things for nothing, Mr. Sutton, especially white men, especially not for Apache women." Miles could not argue with her experience, so he did not try. "Then maybe I'm not like most men." "Maybe," she said, "or maybe you're just better at hiding what you want." They made camp that night beside a small stream in a clearing surrounded by ponderosa pines. Miles built a fire while Ayanna tended to Dakota, changing him with practiced efficiency, using cloths she had somehow managed to preserve through all her troubles. Miles had brought supplies from Billings, simple fare, but more than adequate. Jerky hardtack dried apples, coffee, a small tin of condensed milk for Dakota. He laid them out near the fire and stepped back, letting Ayanna take what she needed. She studied the food for a moment, then looked at him with an expression he could not read. "In my mother's culture, sharing food is a sign of respect, of treating someone as human rather than enemy." Miles met her gaze steadily. "Then I respect you, and I don't consider you an enemy." Something shifted in her face. Not softness exactly, but perhaps a slight lowering of the walls she had built around herself. They ate in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the fire. Dakota slept in a nest of blankets Ayanna had made for him, his small chest rising and falling with the easy rhythm of infant sleep. After the meal, Miles offered to take first watch. Ayanna did not argue. She wrapped herself in a blanket beside Dakota and closed her eyes. But Miles could tell from the tension in her body that she was not sleeping. She was listening, alert to any sound or movement that might signal danger. Miles sat with his back against a tree trunk, his rifle across his knees, and watched the fire burn down to embers. Stars emerged overhead, brilliant and cold, in the clear mountain air. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness, hunting. He did not know when he became aware of Ayanna watching him. He looked over and found her eyes open, reflecting the dying firelight. "You fought in the war," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "Against the South." "Yes." "And after—" Miles hesitated. Here was the precipice. One more step and he would tumble into truth. "After I was sent west. Indian campaigns." Ayanna's expression did not change, but Miles saw her hand move almost imperceptibly toward the knife she kept hidden in her blankets. "Which campaigns?" "Several. Arizona mostly. Some in New Mexico." "When—" Miles's mouth went dry. 75 through 77. The dates hung in the air between them like smoke. Ayanna sat up slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "What unit?" "7th Cavalry." Her breath caught. Just a hitch, barely noticeable, but Miles heard it clear as thunder. "Pennsylvania 7th." "Yes." They stared at each other across the fire. In the flickering light, Miles could see her mind working, fitting pieces together, following the thread of memory back through 2 years of pain and loss and survival. Her hand moved to her wrist, covering the scar. "There was a raid," she said slowly. "White Mountains. September of 76, Pennsylvania 7th. Miles could not lie, would not compound his sins with cowardice. "Yes." "You were there." "Yes." The word fell like a stone into still water. Ripples spread outward, disturbing everything. Ayanna stood, the blanket falling from her shoulders. Dakota stirred but did not wake. She took a step toward Miles, then another, until she stood at the edge of the firelight. In the darkness beyond the flames, her face was shadowed, impossible to read. But Miles could feel her fury, like heat from a forge. "My first husband died in that raid," she said, her voice low and shaking. "Nalnish, he was 24 years old. He died trying to protect our village, trying to protect me and our child." Miles stood as well, setting his rifle aside, making no move toward his weapons. If she chose to kill him now, he would not resist. "I know," he said quietly. "You know." She repeated the words as if tasting them, finding them bitter. "You know because you were there. You know because you—" Her voice broke. "Did you kill him? Did you pull the trigger?" This was the moment. The cliff edge. Miles could lie. Could claim he had been somewhere else in the village. could preserve the fragile peace they had constructed over the past hours. But he had built his life on a foundation of lies and blood, and he was tired. So very tired. "I don't know," he said, and it was the truth. "I killed a warrior that day. Apache defending his family. But I never learned his name, never knew who he was beyond that moment when I pulled the trigger." Ayanna closed her eyes. Tears streaked down her face, catching the firelight. "But you remember me," she said. "You knew my scar. You rode 4 days because you knew it was me being sold in Redemption Creek." "Yes." "Why guilt did you think buying me would somehow make up for killing my husband?" "No," Miles said. "Nothing can make up for that. But I couldn't let you be sold. I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. So instead you bought me yourself." Her eyes opened, burning with anger and grief, and something else Miles could not name. "What's the difference? I'm still property, still owned by a white man who destroyed my life. You're not property. You're free to leave right now if that's what you want. Take Dakota, take the wagon, take everything. I won't stop you." Ayanna laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Free, where would I go? Back to Redemption Creek, to another town that would sell me to the highest bidder. To San Carlos, where they pen us up like animals." She shook her head. "There is no freedom for women like me, Mr. Sutton. There is only choosing which cage we can best survive in." The truth of her words hung between them, ugly and undeniable. "I'm sorry," Miles said, "for what I did, for what I failed to do, for all of it." "Sorry," she repeated flatly. "That word means nothing. Sorry doesn't bring Nalnish back. Sorry doesn't give Dakota his father. Sorry is just a sound white men make to feel better about the things they've done." She was right, and Miles knew it, but he had no other words to offer. Ayanna wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking smaller and more fragile than Miles had yet seen her. "I should kill you," she said quietly, "for Nalnish, for my people, for everything that's been taken from us. I wouldn't stop you." They stood there in the firelight, two people bound together by violence and chance and choices neither of them could undo. Finally, Ayanna spoke again, her voice so low Miles barely heard it. "But I won't. Because Dakota needs to survive, and you're the only chance I have to keep him safe." She looked at Miles with eyes that held nothing but cold calculation. "So I will go to your ranch. I will accept your protection, and I will watch you, Miles Sutton, every moment. And if you give me even one reason to believe you mean us harm, I will end you. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Good." She turned and walked back to where Dakota slept, wrapped herself in the blanket again, and lay down with her back to Miles in the fire. Miles sat back down, his rifle across his knees, and stared into the embers. He had told her the truth. Not all of it, but enough. She knew he had been at the raid, knew he had likely killed her husband. And she had chosen to stay anyway, not because she forgave him or trusted him, but because she had no other choice. It was, Miles reflected, probably more than he deserved. The rest of the night passed in silence. Miles kept watch, though he doubted Ayanna slept. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small human dramas being played out below. When dawn came cold and gray, they broke camp without speaking. Miles harnessed the horses, while Ayanna fed Dakota and prepared for another day of travel. As they climbed back onto the wagon, Miles noticed something he had not seen the night before. Ayanna had tucked a knife into her belt, the handle visible and accessible. A statement of intent, a promise of consequences. He did not comment on it, simply clicked his tongue to the horses and guided them back onto the road north. They had one more day of travel before reaching the ranch. One more day of silence and suspicion and the weight of truths only partially revealed. And in that moment, sitting beside a woman who had every right to hate him, Miles Sutton understood that he had not saved Ayanna Redhawk by buying her freedom in Redemption Creek. He had simply traded one kind of prison for another, and now they were both locked inside it, bound together by blood and debt, and the terrible knowledge that some sins could never be washed clean, no matter how much gold changed hands or how many miles stretched between them and the past. The second day of travel brought them into country that seemed to exist outside of time. The foothills rose around them in rolling waves of pine and aspen, the latter already turning gold with the promise of autumn's end. Clear streams cut through the landscape like veins of silver, and the air held a crispness that spoke of snow not far behind. Miles guided the wagon with the ease of long familiarity, following trails that were sometimes barely visible beneath the accumulated pine needles and fallen leaves. Ayanna sat beside him, Dakota content in her lap, after his morning feeding, and said nothing. The knife remained visible at her belt. Her eyes remained watchful. They stopped twice during the day. Once to water the horses and eat a cold meal of jerky and hardtack. Once in mid-afternoon when Dakota needed changing and Ayanna needed privacy. Each time Miles kept his distance, tending to the horses or checking the wagon's wheels, giving her the space she had not asked for but clearly required. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that matched Ayanna's eyes, Miles guided the wagon up a final rise. At the crest he pulled the horses to a stop. "There," he said quietly. "That's home." Below them, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering ponderosas, sat a log cabin. It was modest in size but solidly built, with a stone chimney rising from one end and a covered porch running along the front. Smoke curled from the chimney where Miles had banked the fire before leaving days ago, a thin gray ribbon against the darkening sky. Beyond the cabin stood a barn and corral, well-maintained and sturdy. In the corral, several horses grazed peacefully. A small creek wound through the property, its banks lined with willows that whispered in the evening breeze. A vegetable garden, now past its prime, but still showing evidence of careful tending, occupied a sunny patch to the south of the cabin. It was in its way beautiful. Not grand or impressive, but possessing the kind of honest beauty that came from hard work and attention to detail. A place built by someone who intended to stay, to put down roots in soil that had seen too much blood. Ayanna studied the scene in silence. Miles watched her from the corner of his eye, trying to gauge her reaction and finding her expression as unreadable as ever. Finally she spoke. "You built this yourself. Most of it. Had help with the barn raising. Neighbors from Whitefish Creek, the town about 10 miles north. But the cabin is my work." "How long have you been here?" 6 years. Bought the land when I mustered out. It was nothing then, just wilderness and the ruins of an old trapper's shelter. I've been building it piece by piece ever since." Ayanna's gaze swept across the property again, taking in details Miles knew she was cataloging for later use. Escape routes, perhaps, defensible positions, the habits of survival ran deep. Then her eyes caught on something beside the cabin's front door, and Miles saw her stiffen almost imperceptibly. Hanging there, moving gently in the breeze, was a dream catcher, simple in construction, made of willow and sinew, and decorated with a few small feathers, but unmistakably native in origin. "Where did you get that?" Ayanna asked, her voice carefully neutral. Miles clicked his tongue to the horses, guiding them down the slope toward the cabin. "Crow family. They live about 15 miles north. Last winter we had a bad blizzard, and their youngest boy got separated from the family, lost in a whiteout. I found him half frozen, brought him back here to warm up. When I returned him to his family the next day, his mother gave me that. Said it would help keep the bad dreams away." He could feel Ayanna's eyes on him reassessing. "And has it—" Miles thought of the nightmares that still woke him in the darkest hours, the faces of the dead who visited him nightly, the sound of screaming that echoed in his skull. "No," he admitted, "but I keep it anyway. Seems disrespectful to refuse a gift given in good faith." They reached the cabin as full darkness fell. Miles helped Ayanna down from the wagon, then busied himself with unhitching the horses while she stood on the porch, Dakota in her arms, and looked at what would be her home for however long this arrangement lasted. Miles carried their few belongings inside and lit lamps, while Ayanna followed slowly, her eyes adjusting to the interior. The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder against one wall. A stone fireplace dominated one end, and Miles moved immediately to stoke the banked fire back to life. A wooden table with 4 chairs sat in the center of the room. Along the walls were shelves holding books, cooking implements, and the accumulated possessions of 6 years of solitary living. A door at the back led to what Miles had intended as a storage room, but had converted into a small bedroom when he knew Ayanna and Dakota were coming. It held a bed, a chest of drawers, and a small crib he had hastily constructed during his brief stop here before riding to Redemption Creek. "That room is yours and Dakota's," Miles said, gesturing toward the door. "I'll sleep in the loft. There's a basin and pitcher for washing, and I can heat water on the fire if you need it warm." Ayanna walked through the cabin slowly, running her hand along the table's edge, examining the books on the shelves, looking out the windows at the darkening landscape beyond. Miles watched her and tried to see his home through her eyes. Simple, rustic, but clean and well-kept, showing evidence of a man who took care with what was his. She paused at the bookshelf, her fingers tracing the spines. Shakespeare. A Bible that looked more decorative than used. A dog-eared copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and several volumes on frontier botany and medicinal plants. "You read about plants?" she asked. Seemed useful to know. Living out here alone, a man needs to be able to doctor himself. "And did you learn anything?" Miles moved to stand beside her, careful to maintain distance, and pulled one of the volumes from the shelf. He opened it to a page marked with a strip of leather. "Willow bark for pain and fever, yarrow to stop bleeding, sage for cleaning wounds, elderberry for coughs." He looked at her. "The Crow family taught me some things the books didn't have. How to make poultices from pine pitch, which mushrooms are safe and which will kill you. Your people have knowledge that goes back thousands of years. Seemed foolish not to learn from it." Something flickered in Ayanna's eyes. Not warmth exactly, but perhaps a slight thaw in the permafrost of her regard. Dakota chose that moment to announce his hunger with a series of increasingly insistent cries. Ayanna immediately shifted into the practiced movements of motherhood, settling into one of the chairs by the fire and beginning to feed him. Miles retreated to the bedroom, giving her privacy, and used the time to unpack the few things they had brought. When he emerged, Dakota was drowsy and content, and Ayanna was gently patting his back to encourage a burp. "There's stew in the pot," Miles said. "I made it before I left, kept it cold in the root cellar. I can warm it up if you're hungry." "I can do it," Ayanna said. "You've been driving all day." But she did not move to do so, focused on Dakota, so Miles ladled stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table with fresh bread from the Whitefish Creek bakery he had purchased on his way through town. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and Dakota's soft breathing as he dozed in his mother's arms. The stew was simple: venison, potatoes, carrots, onions. Nothing fancy but hearty and well-seasoned. When they had finished, Miles cleared the dishes and heated water for washing them. Ayanna watched him work this strange white man who killed Apache warriors, and then learned their medicine, who lived alone in the wilderness and kept his cabin cleaner than most homes in town. "Where do you want me to sleep?" he asked when the dishes were done. "Where you said, the loft. And if you need anything during the night, I'll hear you. Just call out." Ayanna nodded but said nothing. Miles climbed the ladder to the loft, which held a simple bed and a few personal belongings. He could hear Ayanna moving below, settling Dakota in the crib, preparing herself for sleep. He lay in the darkness and listened to the sounds of his home occupied by people who were not him. It felt strange, foreign, but not, he admitted to himself, entirely unwelcome. Below, Ayanna lay in the bed that smelled of pine and wood smoke and the man who had built this place with his own hands. Dakota slept peacefully in his crib beside her. She stared at the ceiling and tried to sort through the tangled mass of her thoughts. Miles Sutton had been at the raid that killed Nalnish, had probably pulled the trigger himself. By all rights, she should kill him in his sleep and take Dakota somewhere, anywhere, far from this place. But where would she go? He had been right about that. She had no money, no resources, no family to turn to. The reservations were death by slow starvation. The towns were full of men like the ones who had bid on her in Redemption Creek. At least here she had a roof and food, and a man who seemed genuinely committed to leaving her alone. And there was something else, something she was not ready to examine too closely: the dreamcatcher, the books on plants. The way he had given her privacy without being asked, the careful respect in his voice when he spoke her name. These were not the actions of a man who saw her as less than human. These were the actions of someone trying, however imperfectly, to do right by her. It did not excuse what he had done, could never excuse it, but it complicated things in ways Ayanna was not prepared to deal with. She closed her eyes and willed sleep to come, knowing it would be hours before it did. The days fell into a rhythm. Miles rose before dawn each morning to tend the horses and cattle, to chop wood and haul water, and do the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch functioning. Ayanna cared for Takeda and explored the cabin while Miles was outside familiarizing herself with every corner and crevice. She found his rifle above the door, his pistol in a drawer by his bed in the loft. A third weapon, a hunting knife kept sharp and oiled in the barn. She cataloged them all, measuring distances and access points, calculating how quickly she could arm herself if needed. She also found his small collection of books, more extensive than she had initially realized. Poetry and philosophy mixed with practical manuals on animal husbandry and farming, a man educated beyond what his rough exterior suggested. And in the bedroom under the simple bed frame, she found a locked wooden box. It was small, perhaps a foot long and half as wide, made of dark wood, and fitted with a simple padlock. Ayanna lifted it carefully, testing its weight. Not heavy. Something inside shifted when she tilted it, papers perhaps, or small objects. She set it back exactly where she had found it and said nothing. October gave way to November, and with it came the first serious snowfall. Miles had been right about the cabin's construction. It was tight and well insulated, keeping the cold at bay, while the fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth. But the snow also meant isolation. The road to Whitefish Creek became impassable, except on horseback, and even that was dangerous. They were effectively alone. Takeda thrived in the clean mountain air. He had begun pulling himself up on furniture, eager to explore his world despite his mother's constant vigilance. Miles had fashioned a simple wooden pen to keep him safe when Ayanna needed her hands free, and the baby seemed content to play within it, banging his wooden toys together with single-minded determination. One evening, about 3 weeks after their arrival, Takeda was fussing with the particular insistence that meant new teeth were coming in. He had barely slept the night before, and Ayanna's exhaustion showed in the dark circles under her eyes. Miles appeared from the barn carrying a bundle of herbs. Without being asked, he set a pot of water to boil on the fire and dropped the herbs in letting them steep. "Willow bark," he said quietly. "Let it cool to lukewarm, then you can rub it on his gums with a clean cloth. Should help with the pain." Ayanna looked at the pot, then at Miles. "Where did you learn this specifically? The books don't usually have such detailed instructions for babies." The Crow woman. She had 6 children. She showed me how to prepare it when her youngest was teething. Ayanna waited until the preparation was ready, then followed his instructions. Within half an hour, Takeda's crying had subsided to occasional whimpers, and he finally fell into exhausted sleep. "Thank you," Ayanna said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. Gratitude toward this man seemed like a betrayal of Nalnish's memory. Miles nodded and returned to whatever work he had been doing in the barn. But the next day, when she went to thank him again, she found him in the corral, working with a young horse, his movements patient and gentle, and she paused to watch. He spoke to the animal in a low, steady voice, nonsense words meant only to soothe and reassure. The horse, initially skittish, gradually calmed under his handling. There was no violence in him, Ayanna realized. Not in this moment. Whatever he had been during the war, whatever blood stained his hands, he had built a life here based on gentleness and care. It should not matter. It did not change the past. But she found herself watching him with something other than pure suspicion. The first heavy snowfall came in mid-November, transforming the landscape overnight into a world of white silence. Ayanna woke to find 6 inches blanketing the ground, and more falling steadily from a gray sky that promised days of this weather. She wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cold, clean air. Montana winter was different from Arizona, but there was a beauty to it that called to something deep inside her. The pines wore their snow like ceremonial dress. The creek still ran through ice formed along its edges, creating intricate patterns that caught the weak morning light. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Miles emerging from the cabin carrying 2 cups of coffee. He offered one to her, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. They stood side by side, not quite comfortable, but not openly hostile either, and watched the snow fall. "Do you fear winter?" Ayanna asked, surprising herself with the question. Miles considered sipping his coffee. No, I fear spring. Why? Because spring reminds me of all the things I destroyed. The answer hung in the cold air between them. Ayanna thought of her own relationship with the seasons, how autumn brought memories of the harvest celebrations of her childhood before everything fell apart, how spring meant the anniversary of Nalnish's death, of the raid that scattered her world like seeds on the wind. I understand that, she said quietly. Miles looked at her, and for the first time she met his gaze fully without anger or calculation. Just two people who carried their dead with them, who bore the weight of loss like stones in their pockets. Do you still dream of them? He asked. Every night, Nalnish, my mother, my father, though I don't know if he's dead or alive, the people from my village, they visit me and ask why I'm still here when they are not. What do you tell them? That I don't know, that I'm sorry, that I would join them if not for Dakota. Miles nodded slowly. I dream of the men I killed. They don't ask me anything. They just stare, like they're waiting for me to explain something I can't put into words. They stood in silence after that, drinking their coffee as snow accumulated on the porch railing and the world grew quieter still. It was the first real conversation they had shared that was not about practical matters or veiled accusations. And when they went back inside, something between them had shifted fractionally. Not forgiveness, not friendship, but perhaps the beginning of something that might, given time and patience, grow into understanding. 3 days later, while Miles was out checking on the cattle in the southern pasture and Dakota napped peacefully in his crib, Ayanna made her decision. She retrieved the locked box from under the bed and carried it to the main room where the light was better. The lock was simple, designed more to keep the box closed against accidental opening than to withstand a determined effort. Ayanna had learned many things in her life, including how to open simple locks. A hairpin patience and steady hands were all that was required. The lock clicked open. Inside the box she found 3 items. First, a small tintype photograph showing 2 young men in Union Army uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the invincibility of youth. One was clearly Miles, though younger, unlined by hardship. The other man had red hair and an Irish look about him. On the back, written in fading ink, were 2 names and a date. Miles Sutton and Patrick Flynn, 1864. Ayanna's breath caught. Patrick Flynn, her late husband's name. Could it be the same man? The second item was a collection of military medals and papers. Honorable discharge, commendations for bravery, a faded battle ribbon, the accumulated evidence of Miles Sutton's service to a country that had rewarded him by asking him to kill people who had never threatened Pennsylvania. The third item was a leather-bound journal. Ayanna opened it with trembling hands. The entries were sporadic, written in Miles's careful script. They chronicled battles and marches, camps and comrades, the daily tedium of military life, punctuated by moments of terror. She flipped through the pages, watching the dates progress. 1863, 1864, 1865, as the Civil War ground to its bloody conclusion. Then a gap. No entries for months. When they resumed, the tone had changed. The entries were shorter, darker, filled with the despair the earlier pages had lacked. 1875, Indian Territory, First Patrol, saw things I will not write down. 1876, another village pacified. That's what Captain Morrison calls it, pacified. As if we brought peace instead of fire. And then September 1876, Arizona Territory. The entry was longer than most, and Ayanna's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the journal. Today we raided the Apache camp in White Mountain area. Captain ordered no survivors except women and children for labor transport. We set fire to their homes. They fought. They always fight. Why wouldn't they? This is their land. We are the invaders. I shot a warrior defending his family. He could not have been more than 25. He burst from a burning dwelling with a rifle fired wildly, and I fired back. Training, instinct, murder. Call it what you will. He fell. As I approached his body, I saw a woman emerge from the smoke. She was young, perhaps 22, and clearly with child, her belly swollen beneath her doeskin dress. In her arms she carried a bundle, though whether it held an infant or merely belongings I could not tell through the smoke. Our eyes met for 3 seconds. I do not know what she saw in my face, but I saw everything in hers. Grief, rage, a love so fierce it made my chest ache. She had a scar on her left wrist, shaped like a crescent moon. I raised my rifle. And I could not pull the trigger. I let her go, disobeyed direct orders. If Morrison had seen, he would have court-martialed me. But I could not kill another mother, could not add that infant to the pile of bodies my hands have built. The warrior I killed was probably her husband. He died defending them, and I took him from her. But I let her live. Perhaps that balances one soul against all the others. Perhaps not. Perhaps nothing balances anything, and we are all just damned, every one of us, soldiers and warriors alike. The entry ended there, but on the facing page was a drawing, pencil on paper, showing remarkable skill. A woman's face, high cheekbones, strong nose, eyes that held both sorrow and strength, hair falling loose around her shoulders. And there, on her wrist, the crescent scar. It was Ayanna, a perfect rendering drawn from memory, preserved in this journal for 2 years. Below the drawing, in smaller script, Miles had written, "If there is a God, let me find her again someday. Let me know that she survived. Let me do something, anything, to atone for what I took from her." Ayanna's vision blurred. Tears fell onto the page, and she hastily wiped them away before they could damage the ink. Her hands trembled so violently that she had to set the journal down. He knew. From the moment he heard about the auction, he knew it was her. He had not come to Redemption Creek by chance. He had come because he recognized the description, the scar, the timeline. He had come because for 2 years he had been haunted by her face. And Patrick Flynn, the kind Irish man who had married her when she was desperate and alone at San Carlos, who had given her a home and a name, and fathered Dakota, had been Miles's friend, his brother in arms. The photograph proved it. The complexity of it threatened to overwhelm her. Miles had killed Nalnish. Miles had spared her life. Miles had been friends with Patrick. Miles had ridden 4 days to buy her freedom, not out of generic nobility, but out of specific personal guilt, and something that looked disturbingly like devotion. She should be furious, should feel even more betrayed than before, but instead she felt something else, something that frightened her more than anger ever could. Understanding. Because she too carried the faces of those she had lost. She too woke in the night haunted by the weight of survival when others had died. She too knew what it meant to live in the shadow of choices that could never be unmade. Ayanna carefully replaced everything in the box except the journal, that she kept holding it against her chest as if it contained the answers to questions she had not known how to ask. She relocked the box and returned it to its place under the bed. Then she sat in the rocking chair by the fire, Dakota still sleeping peacefully in the next room, and read through the journal again from beginning to end. By the time Miles returned from the southern pasture, cold and dusted with snow, Ayanna had made a decision. She would not confront him. Not yet. But she would watch him with new eyes, would test his sincerity, would see if the man he claimed to be in these pages matched the man who walked through the door, stomping snow from his boots. That night, after a quiet dinner, and after Dakota had been put to bed, Ayanna remained in the main room instead of retiring immediately. Miles, surprised but not commenting, settled into his usual chair by the fire with a book. They sat in silence for a time, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind outside rattling the windows. "Tell me about Patrick Flynn," Ayanna said finally. Miles looked up from his book, carefully marking his place before setting it aside. "What do you want to know? How you knew him? How he died? Why you never mentioned that he was your friend?" Miles was quiet for a long moment, his face reflecting the firelight. "We served together. Pennsylvania 7th. He saved my life at Chickamauga, took a bullet meant for me. After the war we stayed in touch when we could. Letters mostly. He wrote to tell me he had married, that he was happy, that he had a beautiful wife and a son. But he never mentioned your name or that you were Apache. If he had, I would have known sooner. Would have come looking for you sooner." "When did you learn he had died?" "The prospector in Billings told me. Said Patrick Flynn's widow was being sold in Redemption Creek. I knew it had to be the same Patrick. How many Irish immigrants named Flynn are there in Montana Territory?" He looked at her directly. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. There didn't seem to be a good time, and every day that passed made it harder to find the words. Ayanna absorbed this. Did you love him? As a brother, I mean? Yes. He was one of the best men I've known. Kind, funny, brave in ways that had nothing to do with battle. The kind of man who saw people as people, no matter where they came from or what they looked like. He was good to me, Ayanna said softly. When I had nothing, when even my own people had turned me away because I carried a half-white baby, Patrick offered me a home. He asked nothing in return except that I let him care for us. I did not love him the way I loved Nalnish, but I honored him. And I'm glad he had friends like you. Miles met her eyes. He would want me to take care of you, to make sure you and Dakota were safe. Is that why you're doing this, out of obligation to a dead friend? Partly, Miles admitted, but not entirely. He did not elaborate, and Ayanna did not press. Some truths needed time to ripen before they could be spoken aloud. The days grew shorter, and the first real cold settled over the Montana foothills. By late November, a light snow had fallen enough to dust the ground, but not yet deep enough to make travel impossible. One morning, Miles mentioned over breakfast that Whitefish Creek was holding its annual Founders' Day celebration the coming Saturday. Thought you might like to go, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Get out a bit. Meet some of the neighbors. There'll be music, dancing, food. Ayanna looked up from feeding Dakota, surprised by the suggestion. You want to be seen in public with an Apache wife? Miles met her gaze steadily. I want people to know you're my wife. There's a difference. Ayanna studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but I have nothing suitable to wear. We'll stop by the general store first. Mrs. Caldwell mentioned she had some new dresses in from the last supply train. On Saturday, they made the journey to Whitefish Creek. The road was passable, the wagon rolling smoothly over the frozen ground. Dakota was bundled against the cold, watching the changing landscape with wide, curious eyes. The town was larger than Redemption Creek, more established. The main street boasted several well-maintained buildings, and the square was already filling with people when they arrived. Lanterns hung from posts, and someone had erected a platform for musicians. Their first stop was Caldwell's General Store. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, and a plump woman in her 50s looked up from behind the counter. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and when she saw Miles, her face broke into a genuine smile. Miles Sutton, haven't seen you in ages. Her gaze moved to Ayanna and Dakota, curiosity plain but not unkind. And who might this be? My wife, Ayanna, Miles said, his hand moving to the small of Ayanna's back, a gesture of both support and claim. And our son, Dakota. Ayanna, this is Mrs. Ida Caldwell. She runs the best store in 3 counties. Mrs. Caldwell's eyebrows rose fractionally at the word wife, but her smile did not falter. Well then, welcome to Whitefish Creek, Mrs. Sutton. She came around the counter and reached for Dakota, who went to her willingly. And aren't you a handsome little man, those eyes like the sky in June? Ayanna felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. Mrs. Caldwell's acceptance, genuine and unforced, was a gift she had not expected. Miles mentioned you might have dresses, Ayanna ventured. Oh, indeed, just got some lovely calico in. Come see. Mrs. Caldwell led her to a corner where several ready-made dresses hung. Among them was a deep blue calico with cream-colored trim, simple but well made. When Ayanna tried it on behind a curtained alcove, it fit as if tailored for her. Perfect, Mrs. Caldwell declared when Ayanna emerged. Brings out your eyes. Miles, you're a lucky man. Miles, who had been entertaining Dakota, looked up and went very still. Ayanna felt heat rise to her cheeks under his gaze. Yes, he said quietly, I am. As Miles paid for the dress, Mrs. Caldwell leaned close to Ayanna. He's a good man, that one. Keeps to himself too much, but solid. Treat him well, and he'll move mountains for you. I'm beginning to understand that, Ayanna replied. The celebration was in full swing when they stepped outside. A fiddle had started up, joined by a banjo, and couples were forming sets for dancing. Sheriff Dawson, a tall man with a magnificent mustache, greeted them warmly. Judge Harrison, who had performed their marriage, tipped his hat with a knowing smile. But not all reactions were friendly. Ayanna felt stares, heard whispers. An older woman made a point of turning away, pulling her daughter with her. A group of miners watched with undisguised curiosity and speculation. Then a woman approached. She was perhaps 25, pretty in a delicate way, with blonde hair arranged in elaborate curls and a dress far too fine for a frontier town. Her blue eyes swept over Ayanna with cool assessment. "Miles," she said, her voice carrying across the square, "I heard you'd married. Didn't believe it until now." Miles's posture shifted subtly, becoming more guarded. "Rebecca, this is my wife, Ayanna. Ayanna, Rebecca Wilson. Her father owns the sawmill." Rebecca's smile was sharp at the edges. "An Apache woman. How charitable of you, Miles. You always did have a weakness for lost causes." Before Miles could respond, Ayanna spoke, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "And you, Miss Wilson, seem to have a weakness for bitterness. It ages a woman poorly." Rebecca's face flushed. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned on her heel and stalked away. Mrs. Caldwell, who had witnessed the exchange, laughed outright. "Well done, dear. That girl's been pining after Miles for 3 years. Good to see him finally found someone with backbone." As evening fell, the music grew livelier. Miles hesitated, then offered Ayanna his hand. "Would you dance with me?" Ayanna looked at the couples on the makeshift dance floor, then at Miles's earnest face. "I don't know the steps." "I'll teach you." He led her to join the Virginia reel, and though she stumbled at first, his steady guidance and quiet encouragement helped her find the rhythm. As they moved through the figures, Ayanna became aware of the warmth of his hand at her waist, the strength in his arms, the way he looked at her, as if she were the only person in the square. When the dance ended, they were both slightly breathless, and something had shifted between them, not dramatically, but unmistakably. On the ride home, with Dakota asleep in Ayanna's lap and the stars brilliant overhead, Miles spoke quietly. "Thank you for coming today, for standing beside me, for not backing down from Rebecca. She was rude. I simply responded in kind. You did more than that. You showed everyone watching that you belong at my side, that this marriage is real." Ayanna looked at him in the darkness. "Perhaps it is becoming real, more than either of us expected." Miles reached across and took her hand, and they rode the rest of the way home in companionable silence, their fingers intertwined. By early December, snow lay 3 feet deep in places, and the temperature regularly dropped below zero at night. Miles kept the fire burning constantly, rising in the small hours to add wood, ensuring the cabin stayed warm. Ayanna found herself falling into domestic rhythms she had not experienced since before Nalnish's death. She cooked meals, mended clothes, kept the cabin tidy, not because Miles demanded it, but because having tasks gave her purpose and kept the darker thoughts at bay. And she watched Miles. Watched how he was with Dakota, gentle and patient when the baby fussed. Watched how he respected her space, never entering the bedroom without knocking, always averting his eyes when she needed privacy. Watched how he worked himself to exhaustion every day, as if physical labor could somehow scour away the stains on his conscience. She also noticed things she had missed before. The way his hands trembled sometimes when he thought no one was looking, the haunted expression that crossed his face when he stared into the fire, the nightmares that woke him in the dark hours, causing him to cry out before he caught himself. He was as broken as she was, just in different ways. One afternoon in mid-December, a stranger arrived at the ranch. Ayanna heard the horses first, the sound of multiple animals approaching at a steady pace. She immediately moved to the window, Dakota in her arms, and felt her heart begin to race. Miles was in the barn. She was alone. 3 men dismounted in front of the cabin. 2 wore the badges of deputy marshals. The third was dressed in the neat suit and tie of a government official. His horse better groomed than the others, his saddle more expensive. The official knocked on the door. Ayanna debated not answering, but they had clearly seen smoke from the chimney. She opened the door a crack, keeping Dakota behind her. The official removed his hat, revealing thinning hair, and a face that reminded Ayanna of a weasel. Sharp features, small, calculating eyes. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Samuel Crawford, Bureau of Indian Affairs. Are you the woman known as Ayanna Redhawk, formerly of the San Carlos Reservation?" Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The snow would make escape impossible, especially with Dakota. "Who's asking?" she said, proud that her voice did not shake. "As I said, Bureau of Indian Affairs. We've received reports that an Apache woman is residing here illegally outside reservation boundaries. I'm here to investigate and, if necessary, facilitate your return to San Carlos." Miles emerged from the barn, alerted by the horses. He took in the scene and walked quickly to the cabin, positioning himself beside Ayanna. "Mr. Crawford," he said, his voice hard, "what brings the Bureau to my property?" Crawford's expression shifted, becoming more cautious in the face of Miles's obvious hostility. "Mr. Sutton, I presume we're simply enforcing federal law. All Apache must reside on designated reservations unless they have special dispensation. Mrs. Red Hawk is not on a reservation because she is married to a white man. That makes her exempt from removal orders." Crawford's thin smile did not reach his eyes. "We've examined the records, Mr. Sutton. Patrick Flynn is deceased. His marriage to this woman ended with his death. She has no legal right to be here." Miles stepped forward, his body language shifting into something dangerous. "Then she'll marry again. To me, problem solved." Ayanna's head snapped toward him, but Miles kept his eyes on Crawford. Crawford laughed, a dry sound like dead leaves. "You, a white rancher, wants to marry an Apache squaw. Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe. Believe what you want. We'll ride to the county office next week and file the papers, unless you'd like to wait here in the snow and come with us to verify it personally." The threat was clear. Crawford would not survive long in these conditions without Miles's hospitality, which was clearly not forthcoming. Crawford's expression hardened. "Very well, but understand this, Mr. Sutton. If you're fabricating this marriage to circumvent the law, there will be consequences. I'll be checking those records, and if I find they don't exist, I'll be back with more than 2 deputies." He remounted his horse, his movements stiff with cold and anger. The 3 men rode away, and Miles and Ayanna stood on the porch watching until they disappeared into the tree line. Only then did Ayanna turn to face him. "You just told a federal official we're getting married." "Yes." "Without asking me first." "I'm asking now. Will you marry me, Ayanna, on paper at least, to keep Crawford from taking you and Dakota away?" She wanted to be angry, wanted to rage at him for making decisions about her life, but pragmatism overrode pride. "And what do you expect in return for this marriage?" Miles looked at her steadily. "Nothing. We'll file the papers, make it legal in the eyes of the government, and go on living exactly as we have been. Separate rooms, separate lives. When Crawford loses interest, or you decide you want to leave, we can dissolve it. Why would you do this? You gain nothing. I gain knowing you and Dakota are safe. That's enough." Ayanna searched his face for deceit and found only tired sincerity. "All right," she said finally. "I'll marry you, but Miles, yes. If you ever touch me without permission, if you ever try to claim rights that this paper marriage doesn't give you, I will kill you in your sleep. Do you understand?" "I understand. And I promise on Patrick's memory that you will be safe here. From Crawford, from me, from everyone." They rode to Whitefish Creek 2 days later, leaving before dawn to make the journey there and back in a single day. Dakota was bundled in so many blankets he looked like a small squirming cocoon, and Ayanna held him close as Miles guided the wagon through snow-packed trails. The county office was a small building attached to the sheriff's office. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with spectacles and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her ledger as they entered. "Help you folks. We're here to file for a marriage license," Miles said. The clerk's eyes moved from Miles to Ayanna to Dakota, and something in her expression suggested she had seen stranger things, but not many. Names: Miles Sutton and Ayanna Red Hawk. Age: 32 and 24. Previous marriages. "None for me," Miles said. "She's a widow." The clerk wrote it all down in her ledger, her pen scratching across the paper. "You'll need a witness for the ceremony, and a minister or justice of the peace to perform it." "Can we do it today?" Miles asked. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "In a hurry. Federal officials are questioning the legality of Mrs. Red Hawk's residence in Montana. We need to establish her status as my wife as quickly as possible." The clerk's expression softened fractionally. She might not approve of mixed marriages, but she apparently liked federal busybodies even less. "I'll see if Judge Harrison is available. Wait here." She disappeared into a back room. Miles and Ayanna stood in uncomfortable silence, the only sound Dakota's occasional babbling. The clerk returned with an older man in shirt sleeves and suspenders, his white hair wild and his eyes kind. "I'm Judge Harrison. Understand you folks need to be married in a hurry." Yes, sir, Miles confirmed. And you're both willing participants in this no coercion. He looked at Ayanna as he asked this, and she appreciated that he was giving her a chance to speak up if this was against her will. I'm willing, she said. All right then, Lucy here can serve as witness. Let's get this done. The ceremony took less than 5 minutes. Judge Harrison read the required words from a small book, asked if they consented to be married, and pronounced them husband and wife. Miles had purchased a simple gold band the day before, and he slipped it onto Ayanna's finger with hands that shook slightly. When the judge said, "You may kiss the bride," Miles simply squeezed Ayanna's hand gently and released it. She nodded her thanks for his discretion. They signed the necessary papers, paid the fee, and walked out into the cold December air as husband and wife in the eyes of the law, if not in truth. On the ride back to the ranch, Ayanna looked down at the ring on her finger. It was strange wearing the symbol of marriage to a man she barely knew, a man who had killed her first husband but saved her from a fate worse than death. "Thank you," she said quietly. Miles kept his eyes on the road. "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do. You gave me a choice. You could have just let Crawford take us. This marriage cost you more than you're admitting." "How so?" "Now you're tied to me. To an Apache woman. People will talk. They'll judge you. Your standing in the community will suffer." Miles was quiet for a moment. "Let them talk. I've survived worse than gossip." As they crested the final hill before the ranch came into view, Ayanna realized something that should have frightened her, but somehow didn't. She was beginning to trust Miles Sutton. Not fully, not without reservation, but enough to believe that his promises meant something, that his guilt was genuine, that he was trying in his flawed and fumbling way to be better than what the war had made him. It did not mean she had forgiven him. She might never forgive him. But perhaps forgiveness was not the point. Perhaps simply moving forward, finding a way to live with the weight of the past without being crushed by it, was enough. Christmas came quietly to the ranch. Miles cut a small pine and brought it inside, and Ayanna decorated it with strings of dried berries and pine cones. It was nothing like the celebrations of her childhood, nothing like the winter ceremonies her people had practiced for generations. But it was something, a small gesture toward normalcy in a world that felt anything but normal. On Christmas Eve, after Dakota was asleep, Miles presented Ayanna with a wrapped package. "I made this for you," he said, awkward as a schoolboy. "If you don't like it, I won't be offended." Ayanna unwrapped it carefully, revealing a wooden frame containing a painting. The falls where Miles had sometimes ridden to think, captured in watercolors with surprising skill. The autumn trees surrounding the water glowed gold and red, and the water itself seemed to move on the page. "You painted this? I used to draw before the war. Started again a few years ago. Helps quiet my mind sometimes." Ayanna studied the painting, moved by the care evident in every brushstroke. "It's beautiful, thank you." She had nothing to give him in return, and the asymmetry embarrassed her. But Miles seemed not to expect anything content, simply that she had accepted his gift. They sat by the fire, listening to the wind howl outside, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Ayanna felt something that might, given time and patience, grow into peace. That night, after Miles had climbed to his loft and all was quiet except for the crackling fire, Ayanna retrieved the journal from where she had hidden it in the bedroom. She had read it several times since first opening the box, each time finding new details that complicated her understanding of the man who slept above her. She turned to the entry about the raid, reading once more the words Miles had written in the immediate aftermath. "Her husband, the warrior I killed, died defending them. He was braver than I'll ever be. If there is a God, let me find her again. Let me know she survived." Tears slipped down Ayanna's cheeks, unexpected and unstoppable. She cried for Nalnish dead before he could know his son. She cried for Patrick, kind and gentle, and taken too soon by fever. She cried for herself, for the girl she had been before the world taught her that love was something that could be ripped away without warning. And she cried for Miles, carrying his guilt like a cross on his back, trying to atone for sins that could never be fully absolved. She did not know what the future held, did not know if she could ever truly forgive him for what he had taken from her. But sitting there in the firelight, her son sleeping peacefully in the next room, and her husband by law, if not by love, Asleep above her, Ayanna understood something she had not been willing to admit before. She did not want to leave this place. Not yet, maybe not ever, because here in this rough cabin in the Montana wilderness, with a man haunted by the same ghosts that visited her dreams, she had found something she thought she had lost forever: a home. January arrived with a vengeance. The blizzard that swept down from Canada was the kind that old-timers would talk about for years afterward, the kind that redrew the landscape and tested the limits of human endurance. It began on the third day of the new year, 1879, with a wind that howled like something alive and hungry, rattling the cabin windows and finding every crack in the walls that Miles had thought were sealed. The snow came sideways, so thick that standing on the porch, Ayanna could not see the barn 20 yards away. It fell for 3 days without ceasing, accumulating in drifts that reached the cabin's eaves and buried the fence posts entirely. The temperature plummeted to 20 below zero, then 30, then lower still. At night, the cold was so intense that ice formed on the inside of the windows, despite the fire burning constantly in the hearth. Miles had prepared well. The root cellar was stocked with preserved vegetables, smoked meat sacks of flour and cornmeal. The wood pile he had spent autumn building was tall enough to last months if needed. The cattle and horses had been moved to the sheltered southern pasture where natural windbreaks and a small cave provided protection. But preparation could only go so far. This storm was testing them all. On the fourth day, when the snow finally stopped and the wind died to a mournful whisper, they emerged to find a world transformed. The ranch had become an island in an ocean of white. The paths Miles had carefully maintained were gone. The creek was frozen solid. Even the air seemed different, thinner and sharper, as if the storm had scoured away everything but the essential. Miles spent that day digging paths from the cabin to the barn, from the barn to the well, from the well back to the cabin. Ayanna watched from the window, Dakota on her hip, and saw how Miles moved with methodical determination, one shovelful at a time, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He worked until dark came inside, with his face raw from cold and his clothes stiff with frozen sweat, and collapsed into a chair by the fire without speaking. Ayanna heated water and brought him a basin to wash his hands and face. She ladled stew into a bowl and set it before him with bread and butter. She did not ask if he was all right, because the question was pointless. They were all doing what needed to be done to survive, and that was enough. But that night, as she prepared for bed, she noticed the cabin felt different, smaller. The distance she had carefully maintained between herself and Miles seemed to have shrunk along with the available space. The loft was colder than usual, and she heard Miles moving around up there longer than normal, adding blankets, trying to stay warm. The next morning, she woke to find frost had formed on the inside of her bedroom window, despite the fire. Dakota's hands were cold when she lifted him from his crib, and he whimpered in a way that suggested discomfort rather than hunger. She bundled him in extra blankets and brought him to the main room where Miles was already stoking the fire to a roaring blaze. "It's too cold," he said without preamble. "The loft is losing heat faster than the fire can replace it, and your room is barely better." Ayanna nodded, having reached the same conclusion. "What do you suggest?" Miles gestured to the main room. "We all sleep out here tonight, close to the fire. I'll set up pallets on the floor. We can hang blankets to create some privacy if you want, but we need to stay warm." It made sense. Ayanna knew it made sense. But the thought of sleeping in the same room as Miles, with only a few feet of space between them, sent a flutter of something through her chest that was not entirely fear. "All right," she said. That evening, Miles arranged their sleeping area with meticulous care. 2 pallets on opposite sides of the fireplace, each thick with blankets and positioned to catch the maximum heat. He strung a rope between 2 wall pegs and hung a blanket to create a screen for Ayanna's side, giving her the privacy she needed for nursing Dakota and changing clothes. They ate dinner in near silence, the wind outside beginning to pick up again, promising another night of bitter cold. Dakota was fussy, upset by the disruption to his routine, and Ayanna walked him back and forth across the cabin floor, bouncing him gently and singing soft songs in Apache that her mother had sung to her. Miles watched them from his chair, his expression unreadable in the firelight. When Dakota finally settled and nursed himself to sleep, Ayanna laid him in the nest of blankets she had prepared for him between the two pallets, close enough to the fire for warmth, but not so close as to be dangerous. "Good night," she said to Miles, and disappeared behind her blanket screen. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind and the fire and Miles's breathing on the other side of the room. This was the closest they had been since their strange marriage began. She could hear every shift of his body, every sigh, every moment when his breathing changed rhythm. Sleep came eventually, but it brought dreams with it. She was back in the White Mountains. Smoke filled her lungs. Fire ate at the wickiups, consuming everything she had known. She held a baby to her chest, but when she looked down, it was not the infant who would become Dakota. It was a different child, the one she had lost years before, the one who never drew breath. Nalnish was running toward her, his face painted for war, his rifle raised. But he was not shooting at enemies. He was shooting at her. His eyes, once so full of love, were empty and accusing. "You betrayed me," he said, though his lips did not move. "You live while I am dead. You smile while I rot in the earth. You lie with the man who killed me." "No," Ayanna tried to say, but no sound came from her mouth. "No, I don't. I haven't." But even as she denied it, she knew it was not entirely true, because she had smiled at Miles, had felt something warm when he was kind to Dakota, had allowed herself to think of this cabin as home. The dream shifted. Now she was in the burning wickiup and Miles was outside, his rifle raised. But instead of letting her go, he pulled the trigger. The bullet struck her chest and she felt the baby tumbling from her arms. As the darkness closed in, she heard Nilnish laughing, triumphant. Ayanna woke with a gasp, her heart hammering, sweat coating her skin despite the cold. For a moment she did not know where she was. The firelight confused her, the unfamiliar sounds, the wrongness of everything. Then a hand touched her shoulder, gentle but firm, and Miles's voice came through the darkness. "Ayanna, you're safe. It's just a dream." She jerked away from his touch, disoriented, and Dakota woke with a cry at the sudden movement. Miles immediately withdrew, giving her space, but she could see his face in the firelight creased with concern. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You were crying out. I thought you were hurt." Ayanna's breathing slowly returned to normal. She gathered Dakota to her chest, soothing him with automatic movements, while her mind struggled to separate dream from reality. "Just a nightmare," she managed. "I'm fine." But she was trembling, and Miles could see it. "I'll make tea," he said. "Sometimes it helps." He moved to the kitchen area and set water to heat, giving her time to compose herself. Ayanna nursed Dakota back to sleep, her hands still shaking the images from the dream refusing to fade. When Miles brought her the tea, she accepted it gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked, settling back onto his own pallet, but not lying down, instead sitting cross-legged like a man prepared to keep vigil. "No. Yes. I don't know." Ayanna sipped the tea, felt the warmth spread through her chest. "I dream of them. Nalnish, my mother, my father, the people from my village. They visit me and ask why I'm still alive when they are not." Miles nodded slowly. "What do you tell them? That I don't have an answer, that I would join them if not for Dakota." She looked at Miles across the space between them. "Do you dream of the people you killed every night? What do they say to you?" "Nothing. They just stare, like they're waiting for something from me that I can't give them." They sat in silence for a while, drinking their tea, two people bound together by guilt and ghosts. "In my dream tonight," Ayanna said slowly, "Nalnish said I betrayed him, because I'm here, because I'm not dead, because—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "Because you're starting to heal," Miles offered quietly. Ayanna's hands tightened on her cup. "How can I heal when he never will? How can I find peace when he has none?" Miles set down his own cup and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his face serious. "I don't know much about Apache beliefs, but I know what the chaplain used to say during the war when soldiers would die and their friends would survive. He said the dead don't want us to suffer. They want us to live, to honor their memory by building something good from the ruins they left behind." "That's easy to say when you're not the one who caused the ruins." "You're right, it is." Miles met her eyes. But I also think sometimes the person who caused the ruins is the only one who can help rebuild, not to erase what happened. Nothing can do that. But maybe to create something new, something that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Ayanna thought about this, turning it over in her mind like a stone. Is that why you live the way you do alone out here, helping the Crow family, learning about plants and medicine? Are you trying to rebuild? I'm trying to do less harm than I did before. I don't know if that's the same thing. And me? Ayanna asked the question, surprising her as much as it must have surprised Miles. Am I part of your rebuilding? Or your penance? Miles was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. At first you were penance. A way to balance the scales, even though I know scales can never truly be balanced. But now, he stopped seeming to struggle with the words, now you're more than that. You and Dakota both. You've made this house feel like something other than a place I hide from my past. You've given it life. The honesty in his voice made Ayanna's throat tight. She wanted to be angry, wanted to hold on to her righteous fury and use it as armor against the confusing feelings that were developing beneath it. But anger required energy, and she was so tired of being angry. I don't know how to forgive you, she said finally. I don't know if I ever can. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just for the chance to do right by you and Dakota for as long as you'll let me. They finished their tea in silence. When Ayanna lay back down, she found sleep came easier than expected, and the dreams when they returned were gentler. The blizzard's aftermath left them more isolated than ever. The snow was too deep for the wagon, and even riding horseback to Whitefish Creek would have been dangerous. They were alone together, and the forced proximity stripped away the careful distance they had maintained. Ayanna found herself noticing small things about Miles. The way he always washed the dishes immediately after meals, as if cleanliness was a form of control in a chaotic world. The way he talked to the horses when he thought no one was listening, his voice soft and encouraging. The way he carved small toys for Dakota during the long evenings, his large hands surprisingly deft with the knife. She also noticed his nightmares. 3 or 4 times a week he would cry out in his sleep, sometimes in words, sometimes in wordless sounds of anguish. She heard him wake, gasping, heard the creak of his palate as he sat up and tried to calm his breathing. One night in mid-January, his nightmare was particularly bad. Ayanna woke to hear him shouting actual words this time. No, they're just children, Morrison. They're children. She rose and moved around the blanket screen before she could think better of it. Miles was sitting up, his face pale and slicked with sweat, his hands shaking. Miles, she said quietly, you're dreaming. Wake up. His eyes focused on her, gradually confusion giving way to recognition and then shame. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. What were you dreaming about? Miles scrubbed his hands over his face. A raid. Different from the one where... He gestured vaguely, unable to say the rest. This was in New Mexico. There were children. Captain Morrison said they would grow up to be warriors. Said it was better to end it now. Did you... No, I refused the order. Got disciplined for it. But some of the other men... His voice cracked. I saved 3 children that day, Ayanna. But I couldn't save them all. Ayanna sat down on the edge of his pallet, maintaining a careful distance, but close enough that he could feel her presence. You saved some. That matters. Does it? When I killed so many others? I don't know, Ayanna said honestly, but I think trying to do right even when you've done wrong is better than not trying at all. They sat together in the firelight, not touching, but near enough that the warmth of one reached the other. After a while, Ayanna began to hum a melody, one of the songs her mother had taught her, a song about the stars and how they remembered every person who had ever lived, keeping their memories bright even when everything else faded. Miles listened, his breathing gradually steadying, and when she finished, he said, Thank you. For what? For not hating me as much as I deserve. Ayanna considered this. I did hate you. I might still hate you, but I'm learning that hate is exhausting. And out here we don't have energy to waste on exhaustion. It was not forgiveness, not absolution, but it was something. A small crack in the wall between them letting through the faintest bit of light. The days blurred together. More snow fell, though never as severely as that first blizzard. Miles and Ayanna developed routines. She cooked breakfast while he tended the animals. He chopped wood while she cared for Dakota. They ate meals together and sat by the fire in the evenings, sometimes talking, sometimes reading, sometimes simply existing in shared silence. Dakota continued to thrive despite the harsh conditions. He was pulling himself up on furniture, now cruising along the edges, babbling constantly in a language only he understood. He had developed a deep attachment to Miles, reaching for him whenever the man entered the cabin, laughing when Miles lifted him high or made funny faces. Watching them together created an ache in Ayanna's chest that she did not want to examine too closely. Dakota was too young to remember Nilnish, too young to know that the man who carved his toys and bounced him on his knee had killed his father. But Ayanna knew, and the knowledge sat heavy in her stomach. One afternoon in late January, with Dakota napping and Miles repairing tack by the fire, Ayanna made a decision. She retrieved the journal from where she had hidden it in the bedroom and brought it to the main room. Miles looked up as she approached, and his face went still when he saw what she was carrying. "I found this weeks ago," Ayanna said without preamble. "I picked the lock on your box. I read every entry." Miles set down the leather he was working on, his hands falling to his lap. "I know." "You know." The lock was scratched in a way it hadn't been before, and the journal was returned to the box in slightly the wrong position. "I notice things like that." Ayanna had not expected this. She had prepared for anger for accusations of invasion of privacy, not for quiet acceptance. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you had a right to know the truth. I should have told you myself instead of making you find it." Ayanna opened the journal to the page about the raid, the one with her sketch. She held it out to Miles. "This is me. You remembered my face for 2 years. You drew me." "Yes." "And Patrick, he was your friend." "Yes." "So when you came to Redemption Creek, you knew. You knew exactly who I was and what you had done." Miles stood, moving to face her directly, but keeping a careful distance. "I knew." Ayanna felt tears burning behind her eyes, fury and pain, and something else all tangled together. "Then this whole time has been a lie. Everything you've done, everything you've said, it's all been about your guilt. About trying to fix what you broke." "At first, yes," Miles admitted. "But Ayanna, it stopped being just about guilt weeks ago. Watching you with Dakota, listening to you sing, learning how strong you are, how brave." He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "You're not just Patrick's widow or the woman from the raid anymore. You're Ayanna, and I—" He stopped again. "You what?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "I love you," Miles said simply. "I know I have no right to. I know it's probably the most selfish thing I've ever felt, but it's true. I love you. I love Dakota. I love the life we've built here, however strange and impossible it is." Ayanna stared at him, the journal shaking in her hands. She wanted to scream at him, wanted to tell him he was delusional, that love could never exist between them, that he was confusing guilt for affection. But the words would not come, because somewhere in the past months something had shifted in her too. She had started looking forward to his presence, had started feeling safe when he was near, had started imagining a future that included him, and the realization terrified her. "How dare you," she said, her voice breaking. "How dare you make me care about you? How dare you be kind and gentle and good when I need you to be a monster? It would be so much easier if you were a monster." Miles stood his ground, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know, I'm sorry." "Sorry?" She laughed bitterly. "You're always sorry, but sorry doesn't change anything." "You're right. It doesn't." "But Ayanna, I'm not asking you to love me back. I'm not asking you to forget what I did. I just needed you to know the truth, all of it, including how I feel." Ayanna looked down at the journal in her hands, at the careful sketch of her face, at the words Miles had written about wanting to find her again, about hoping she had survived. She walked to the door and opened it, letting in a blast of cold air. She stepped out onto the porch and hurled the journal into the snowbank with all her strength. Miles appeared in the doorway behind her. "What are you doing?" "I'm done living in the past," Ayanna said, her voice fierce. "That journal, those memories, all of it. I'm leaving them in the snow. Maybe the spring thaw will wash them away. Maybe they'll sink into the earth and feed something new. I don't know. But I'm not carrying them anymore." She turned to face him, and there were tears on her cheeks, freezing in the bitter air. I don't forgive you, Miles. I may never forgive you. But I'm choosing to live, to move forward, to give Dakota a future that isn't poisoned by the past. And if that means accepting that you're part of that future—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "Then I accept it." Miles stepped out onto the porch, heedless of the cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want you to leave. I'm saying this marriage doesn't have to be just on paper if we don't want it to be. I'm saying—" She took a shaky breath. "I'm saying I think I might love you too, and I hate myself for it. But it's true." Miles reached for her, slowly giving her every chance to pull away, and when she did not, he gathered her into his arms. Ayanna buried her face in his chest and wept, great racking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her bones. She wept for Nalnish and for the girl she had been before the world taught her cruelty. She wept for Patrick's kindness and for her mother's death. She wept for all the ways her life had broken and for the fragile hope that maybe somehow it could be mended. Miles held her and said nothing, one hand stroking her hair, the other wrapped around her back, keeping her upright when her legs threatened to give way. And when her tears finally subsided, he kissed the top of her head with infinite gentleness. "Come inside," he said softly. "You're freezing." They went back into the cabin where Dakota was just beginning to wake from his nap. Ayanna washed her face and composed herself while Miles tended the fire. When she emerged from the bedroom with the baby, Miles was waiting with tea and something in his expression that looked almost like peace. That night, for the first time, Ayanna did not sleep behind the blanket screen. She made her pallet beside Miles's with Dakota between them, and when she woke in the darkest hours from another nightmare, Miles's hand was there to hold hers until sleep returned. 4 days later, Samuel Crawford returned. Ayanna heard the horses first, her senses attuned to danger, even in what had become a peaceful routine. She moved to the window and felt her heart sink. Crawford and his 2 deputies back again, faces grim with purpose. Miles was in the barn. Ayanna scooped up Dakota and stood in the doorway watching as the men dismounted. Crawford removed his hat, his thin face pinched with cold and what looked like triumph. "Mrs. Sutton, or should I say Mrs. Red Hawk, I've been reviewing the marriage records." Miles emerged from the barn, alerted by the horses. He moved quickly to stand beside Ayanna. "Mr. Crawford, what brings you back to my property?" Crawford's smile was sharp and unpleasant. "An interesting discovery, Mr. Sutton. Your marriage to this woman was filed under false pretenses. She provided her Apache name, Ayanna Red Hawk, but the records show that Patrick Flynn's wife was Margaret Flynn, 2 different legal identities. The marriage is invalid." Ayanna felt the world tilt. Of course, she had used her Apache name, reclaiming her identity after years of hiding it, but legally she had been Margaret Flynn. The marriage certificate to Miles under a different name was worthless. Furthermore, Crawford continued, clearly enjoying himself, "I've discovered that Patrick Flynn's estate still has outstanding debts, including debts to the child. As the child is half white and has no legal guardian, he is now a ward of the state. I'm authorized to take him to the Territorial Orphanage in Helena." "No," Ayanna said, her voice flat and dangerous. "You will not take my son." Crawford's expression hardened. "I have the authority. Unless you can prove legal guardianship, which you cannot, as your marriage to Mr. Sutton is invalid, and you are yourself an illegal resident outside reservation boundaries." Miles stepped forward, his body language shifting into something Ayanna had not seen before, something that reminded her he had been a soldier, that he knew how to fight and was prepared to do so. "You're not taking them anywhere." Crawford gestured to his deputies, who moved their hands closer to their weapons. "Mr. Sutton, I advise you not to interfere with federal authority." "Then I advise you to reconsider your position," Miles said, his voice like iron. "Because if you try to take my family, you won't leave this ranch alive." The deputies tensed. Crawford's face flushed with anger. "Are you threatening a federal official? I'm making a promise. Touch them, and you die." The standoff stretched for long seconds, tension thick enough to choke on. Ayanna held Dakota tighter, her mind racing through options, all of them terrible. Then Miles spoke again, his voice still hard but with a different edge. "But there's a better way, a legal way. I'll adopt Dakota officially. Full legal adoption by a white landowner and citizen. And Ayanna and I will remarry this time with her legal name. Margaret Redhawk Flynn Sutton. All the names, all the identities, all accounted for. Crawford's eyes narrowed. You're that determined to keep them. I'm that determined to protect my family. Yes. Crawford studied Miles for a long moment, clearly reassessing. Whatever he saw in Miles's face made him take a step back. Very well, but I'll be checking those records, and if they're not filed properly, if there's even the slightest irregularity, I'll be back. With more than 2 deputies. He remounted his horse, his movements stiff with frustrated authority. The 3 men rode away, and this time Miles and Ayanna stood together, his arm around her shoulders, until they were out of sight. Only then did Ayanna allow herself to breathe. He'll come back, she said quietly. I know, but by then everything will be legal. You and Dakota will be protected. Ayanna turned to look at him. You were prepared to kill for us. Yes. Why? Miles cupped her face gently with one large hand. Because you're mine to protect, both of you, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take you away. The raw possessiveness in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel safer than she had in years. Then we should go to Whitefish Creek as soon as the weather allows, she said. Make it all legal. Make it real. Is that what you want? Not just for protection, but truly? Ayanna reached up and placed her hand over his where it rested against her cheek. Yes, I want this to be real. I want us to be a real family. Miles pulled her close and kissed her, the first real kiss they had shared. It was tentative at first, both of them unsure, but it deepened quickly into something that spoke of hunger and hope, and the tentative beginning of healing. When they broke apart, Dakota was watching them with wide eyes, and then he laughed, a sound of pure joy that made them both smile. 2 weeks later, on a clear February morning, they made the journey to Whitefish Creek. This time there was no rush, no pressure. Just a man and a woman and a child seeking to make official what their hearts had already decided. Judge Harrison performed the ceremony again, and this time when he said, "You may kiss the bride," Miles did so properly, and Ayanna kissed him back, and there was joy in it, despite everything that had brought them to this moment. They filed the adoption papers for Dakota at the same time. Miles Sutton became his legal father in the eyes of the law, and though Dakota would never know Nalnish Ayanna, made Miles promise that they would tell him about his birth father when he was old enough to understand. He should know where he comes from, she said. All of it, the good and the bad. I promise, Miles agreed. No more secrets, no more hidden truths. When they returned to the ranch that evening, everything looked the same, but felt different. This was their home now. Not Miles's home where Ayanna was staying, but a place that belonged to both of them equally, a foundation on which to build something new. Winter gradually loosened its grip. March brought warmer days and the first signs of spring. The snow began to melt, revealing the brown grass beneath. The creek unfroze its waters, running fast and clear. Birds returned, filling the air with song. One morning in late March, Ayanna woke to an unfamiliar sensation. She lay still for a moment, trying to identify it, and then understanding dawned with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. She was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not been certain. Now feeling the subtle changes in her body, she knew. She and Miles had created a life together, a child who would be born of both of their histories, both of their peoples. She told him that evening after Dakota was asleep. Miles was reading by the fire, and she simply sat down beside him and took his hand, placing it on her still, flat stomach. "There's going to be another baby," she said quietly. Miles's eyes went wide, his face cycling through surprise and joy and something like awe. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "Thank you," he whispered, "for this, for giving us a future, for choosing to live despite everything." Ayanna held him tight, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "We're building something new," she said, not forgetting the past but not being destroyed by it either. They sat together by the fire planning for the future. They would need to expand the cabin before the baby came. would need more supplies, more preparation. But they would manage. Together, they would manage. September arrived with golden light and clear skies painting the world in shades of amber and rust. Ayana's pregnancy was now obvious, her belly round and full. Dakota, now 13 months old, was walking confidently and trying to form words, his favorite being something that sounded like Papa when he looked at Miles. They were working in the garden together, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables before the first frost when Ayana saw him. A figure at the edge of the tree line. An old man, his hair white as snow, his face weathered and scarred. He stood watching them motionless, and something about the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself, struck a chord of recognition so deep it made her gasp. Miles heard her and turned, following her gaze. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle he kept nearby when working outside, but Ayana placed her hand on his arm, stopping him. "Wait," she breathed. The old man began walking toward them, slow and careful, his hands visible and empty. As he drew closer, Ayana could see his face more clearly, and her heart began to pound. It was impossible. He had died in the raid. She had seen the soldiers shoot him, had seen him fall, and yet here he stood alive and whole, if aged his eyes the same amber as her own. "Father." The word came out as a whisper, barely audible. The old man stopped 10 feet away. When he spoke, it was in Apache, the words falling on Ayana's ears like rain after a drought. "Daughter, I have searched for you for 3 years. They told me you were dead, but I did not believe them. And now I find you here alive, with child, with a white man and a mixed-blood baby." His tone was neutral, giving no indication whether he approved or condemned what he saw. Ayana moved toward him slowly, hardly daring to believe. When she was close enough to touch, she reached out one trembling hand and placed it on his arm, feeling the solid reality of him. "You're alive. How? The spirits protected me. I was shot but did not die. The crow found me and healed me. I have been living with them, searching for any news of my daughter." He looked past her to Miles, who stood silent and watchful, and something dark moved across his face. "This man, he is your husband." "Yes, and the soldier who killed your first husband." Ayana's breath caught. Her father had always been perceptive, but this knowledge came from somewhere else. She nodded slowly. "Yes." Her father's hand moved to the knife at his belt, and Miles tensed, but the old man did not draw it. Instead, he spoke again, his voice heavy with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I have come to take you home, daughter. Back to our people, away from this man and his world." Ayana looked back at Miles, at Dakota, playing in the dirt near the garden, at the cabin that had become her home. Then she looked at her father, the man she had mourned and missed and thought lost forever. "I am home, Father," she said quietly. "This is my home. These are my people now. Miles and Dakota and the child I carry. I will not leave them." Her father's expression tightened with pain. "Then I have lost you, after all. Not to death, but to the people who destroyed us." "No," Ayana said firmly. "You haven't lost me. But I've found something here. Peace. Purpose. A chance at a future. I'm asking you to see that. To know that. And if you can, to stay. To be part of this family we're building." The old man looked at Miles again, measuring him with eyes that had seen too much suffering. "Can you speak for yourself, white man? Or do you hide behind my daughter's words?" Miles stepped forward, his posture respectful but not subservient. "I can speak. I killed your daughter's first husband in a raid 3 years ago. I've lived with that guilt every day since. When I found her being sold in Redemption Creek, I bought her freedom and brought her here, not to own her, but to give her the safety and choice she deserved. We've built a life together, not because I demanded it, but because she chose it. I love her. I love Dakota, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what she's given me." The old man studied Miles for a long time. Finally he spoke again. "I am Nantai. In your language it means leader. I led my people until the white soldiers destroyed us. Now I lead nothing and no one." He looked at Ayana. "I cannot bless this union, daughter. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But neither will I tear you from it. You are a woman grown, and you have made your choice." He turned as if to leave, but Ayana caught his arm. "Stay, please. Even if you can't accept Miles, even if you can't forgive what was done, stay. Let me know you. Let Dakota know his grandfather. Don't disappear again." Nantai looked at his daughter at the hope and pain mingled in her face, and something in him seemed to soften fractionally. "I will think on it. But first, I must see if I can bear to live among those who destroyed my world." He glanced at Miles again. "We will speak more, you and I. There are things that must be said." Nantai turned and walked back toward the tree line, but this time he did not disappear entirely. Instead, he moved to a cluster of pines about 50 yards from the cabin and began setting up a small camp. He would stay at least for now, close enough to watch, far enough to maintain distance. Ayanna stood watching her hand, unconsciously moving to her swollen belly, feeling the child within kick, as if in response to the weight of the moment. That night, as Ayanna lay in bed beside Miles with Dakota sleeping in his crib and her hand resting on her swollen belly, she felt the weight of her father's presence, like a physical thing. "He'll come around," Miles said quietly in the darkness. "Or he won't. Either way, we'll face it together." Ayanna turned to face him, her eyes adjusting to see his features in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I never thought I'd have this," she whispered. "A home, a family, a future that didn't feel like running." Miles pulled her close, careful of her belly. "You have it now. We both do. And whatever your father decides, whatever comes next, nothing changes that." Outside in his camp among the pines, Nantai sat by a small fire and watched the cabin. He saw the lantern extinguish, saw smoke continue to rise from the chimney, saw the evidence of a life his daughter had built without him. It filled him with grief and anger and something else he was not ready to name. Perhaps in time it might become acceptance, perhaps even something more. But tonight, he simply watched and remembered all that had been lost and all that somehow remained. Inside the cabin, Ayanna drifted to sleep with Miles's heartbeat steady beneath her ear and Dakota's soft breathing nearby. Tomorrow, her father would still be there, his judgment hanging over them like a storm cloud. But tonight, in this moment, she had everything she needed. The child in her womb kicked strong and insistent, and Ayanna smiled in the darkness. Life persisting, love growing despite everything that tried to crush it, hope fragile but fierce taking root in soil that had known too much blood. This was her story now, not the one written by soldiers and raids and loss, but the one she was writing herself word by word, choice by choice, breath by breath. And it was enough. Miles came to stand beside her, and she leaned into his strength. "This changes things," she said quietly. "Yes, but it doesn't change us, unless you want it to." "No, I don't want that." She looked up at him. "But he's right. There are things that must be spoken, truths that need to be acknowledged. This won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is." They stood together in the fading September light, watching as Dakota toddled over to show them a rock he had found, his face bright with innocent joy. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear, and somewhere in the distance an owl called out its hunting song. The past had arrived to meet the present. Old wounds had reopened alongside new life growing in Ayanna's womb, and the future stretched before them uncertain and challenging and full of a hope that felt as fragile as it was fierce. But they would face it together, Ayanna and Miles and Dakota and the child yet to be born. And perhaps, if the spirits were kind, with Nantai as well, a family built from the ruins of war, held together not by blood alone, but by choice and courage and the stubborn refusal to let hatred have the final word. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of winter and the distant dream of spring. And in that moment, standing on the land they had claimed together, Ayanna knew that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. She had found her home, not in the place she had lost, but in the place she had chosen to build. And that made all the difference.